Hello and welcome to the third video in my devlog series. I'm making a game called Welcome to Riot Town. It's essentially a riot simulator. At the end of the last video, I had these simple civilians walking around the city, following each waypoint one at a time. They're pretty stupid and they happily go along their merry way, crossing over the street and bumping into each other. This week I wanted to start work on the actual rioters. Let's bring a bit of carnage into this city. To begin with, I wanted to get an animation in for the rioter. It's going to be pretty simple. Just like in the prototype, these guys are just going to jump up and down excitedly. A bit like the guys in Prison Architect when they start a riot. It's nothing special, but it definitely portrays that they're different from the normal regular citizens. The animation controller is really simple. Are you rioting? Yes, no. If you are, play the jump up and down animation. That's about it. So it didn't take me long to get this working, and it looks pretty funny in the actual game. Now the next thing I had to think about was how are these guys going to navigate around the town? The normal civilians just follow waypoints, and I can't really do that because it's up to the player to decide where these guys go. So I opted for Unity's AI nav agents. I didn't really want to use this for every civilian in the town. I thought that might be a bit overkill. But I could still use it in conjunction with the waypoint system. And it would probably solve my problem about them bumping into each other. But that's for another day. Right now I just wanted to get the nav mesh working in the city. In the past when I've used a nav mesh, it's been a static level. Therefore I could just hit the bake button. But because I'm building this procedurally, I'm going to have to somehow update the nav mesh once all the buildings have been positioned. That's when I came across this Unity package called Nav Mesh Components. It does exactly what I need. You just add a nav mesh source tag to both the buildings and the ground and the terrain, and it seems to do everything for you. It was a bit tricky at first. I think it had some problems interpreting the mesh coming out of Blender. I fixed this by adding a separate mesh renderer and box collider to my building game objects. I disabled the mesh renderer because we don't actually need to see it, but the nav mesh source tag needs it to be there. I think it's just easier for it to interpret a simple Unity cube mesh rather than the complex object coming out of Blender. So I got that fixed, and as you can see, these little guys are following this orange circle around. It looks pretty cool to see them hopping around the different alleyways to get to their destination. Now that the pathfinding was out of the way, it was time to move on to something fun. So back in Blender, I thought it was time to work on my first Smashable, as I call them. I started working on a chair first, followed by a table and some props to go on top of the table. Eventually, there's going to be hundreds of these objects. If you have any suggestions of things that you might find in a typical street that should be smashed, let me know in the comments below. Back in Unity, I set the block spawner to only render one block. I then disabled all of the buildings, so it essentially had a blank canvas for our rioter to play around in. I added the chair to the scene so that the rioter could smash something. Each object that the rioter can smash will have a Smashable script attached to it. How this works is that if a rioter comes in contact with one of these objects via the onTriggerEnter method, it will check whether that smashable item is in the process of being smashed, therefore don't do anything, or if it's available for smashing, it will call its smash method, and this will effectively send that item in a random direction. This will give the impression that this little guy is throwing the chair or flipping the table, but in reality it's the smashable item itself that's doing all the work. In this example, I've hooked these chairs, or smashable items, up to a key code, so whenever I hit the letter L, they go flying. It looks a bit strange because they're hopping around on their own. just a case now of tweaking the mass and the force. The table is going to be slightly heavier than a chair, and a car is going to be a lot heavier than a table. With the table and chairs now working as expected, I wanted to add some items to the table. Not because I thought the game needed it at this point, it's a bit early to be adding enhancements like that, because I wanted to think about the children of Smashables. That is, things that aren't necessarily throwable by themselves, but sitting on top of objects that can be smashed. So I worked on a little menu that would sit on top of the table, and I won't lie, I went into a little bit too much detail, but I think it looks pretty cool. The idea here is that this is going to be a smashable child. You can apply an array of children to any smashable you like. When the parent object gets smashed, it turns the gravity on all its children's smashable items. This allows them to fall off of the table or go flying in any direction that the table is going. So here it is, a small group of hooligans smashing up the tables and chairs that I've laid out in a nice row. So in the last video I mentioned that I had fears that the pavements or the sidewalks just weren't going to be wide enough to position anything that's going to be fun to smash. With the pedestrians walking around, there's not a great deal of room to add tables and outdoor signage and benches, dustbins, that sort of thing. And now that I've built a table and chairs, it's clear that that is the case. So the next thing on my list was to actually widen the pavements, and as a result address how many buildings can appear on each block, because in order to make more space I can either make the grid bigger, which I don't want to do because it's a nice tidy 10 by 10 at the moment, or I have to reduce the number of buildings. So that's the option I went with. So what I'm doing here is mocking up a city block. I'm essentially hard coding some buildings just to give me an idea of space that I have to play with. And instead of using the full 8x8 available squares that were before, I'm now reducing that to a 6x6 grid. So the maximum number of buildings you can get if they're all one wide would be 6 buildings on each row. The next thing to do was to pull in the curbside so that each road effectively becomes half a square wider in each direction. Consequence of that also means that the sidewalks or pavements are now a full 1 block wide. The actual modelling part of this was relatively easy. The difficulty was actually positioning these things in the block spawner. The code to actually position the buildings is rather complicated, so it took a lot of tweaking, but eventually I got there, and this is how it looks. So I was actually quite relieved. I thought it might look a bit bare with 1 building less on either end, but it doesn't look too bad. Obviously my next job was to fix the road markings, which look a little bit stretched and out of place. It's a little bit fiddly trying to line everything up, but it didn't take long. Obviously with the changes in dimensions I also had to go and fix the waypoint system. That was just a case of repositioning stuff by eye. It didn't take that long. So here's what it currently looks like. So this is a 5x5 block, and I guess one of the benefits of reducing the number of buildings is you're reducing the amount of polygons. So that's a lot of windows and other details that the game's not going to have to worry about. I also think this now gives the roads a lot more room. One of the features I want later down the line is to be able to build barricades across the street. This will act as a barrier against the police who are trying to stop your riot, but that's a lot further down the line. So that's pretty much it for this video. I think the next video you're going to see a major overhaul. I want to work on the storefronts a lot more so each one can appear and look completely different. I'd also like to try and set up some restaurants and add generally more street objects. Finally, I'm going to look at the building roofs. They're kind of boring at the moment, they're all the same colour. I think I can add some air conditioning units, maybe some fire escapes, maybe even a helicopter pad. So probably not much functionality, but it's going to look a lot better. So yeah, that's it for this video. Thanks for watching if you got this far. My name's Dan Sanderson and this is Welcome to Riot Town.